Hello, everyone. Welcome to rabble.ca's morning after the 2019 federal election. My name's Libby Davies. I used to be a member of parliament for 18 years, and I'm just delighted today to be joined by Rabble's parliamentary reporter, Karl Nerenberg. Welcome, Karl.
Hi,
Well,
how are you?
folks, good. Well, folks, the political map of Canada has been redrawn following the election that we just had. And as we know, we now have a Liberal minority government. Rabble has invited me and Karl to have a conversation about the election results and what comes next, because that's something that we're all talking about. I know that there are many of you watching across the country and you probably have questions and opinions too. So during this webinar conversation, feel free to place any messages in the chat, and we'll definitely try to incorporate your questions and comments into the discussion. So let's get started. Well, obviously the first thing that we want to talk about is, in a minority parliament, what is it that's possible? I've had some experience with this. I was a member of the NDP and MP in 3 minority parliaments. The first one was in 2004-5 when Paul Martin was the Prime Minister, and the second 2 were Stephen Harper was the Prime Minister, so a Conservative government, 2006 and 2008. And I know, Karl, you were reporting and watching as things unfolded, but I can tell you from the inside, it was a very intense place. A minority parliament is very different than a majority parliament or government. But nevertheless, it's a very interesting situation because it creates all kinds of possibilities that don't usually exist in a majority government, in that it forces the parties to have more dialogue, to have more communication, and to think about working together at different levels, and some are more successful than others. But what's hanging over the parliament, of course, is the threat of a confidence vote and the government falling and then rushing into another election. So I think, looking at the situation now, the NDP has 24, or maybe it's 25 seats, I can't remember the last one. They technically hold the balance of power, but also the combination with the other political parties there is very much in the balance as well. We've already heard from Trudeau that he's planning to approach things on an issue-by-issue basis. That's different from what we have in BC, where there's actually an agreement with the Green Party and the government, the NDP. So it is going to be a very interesting evolution of what takes place here. But one thing I wanted to throw out to you, Karl, that I feel is different this time, is that because there was so much interest in this election, particularly from young people, about the climate crisis and many other questions, that I think it's got to go somehow beyond the parliamentary precinct. I'm hoping that there isn't sort of backroom deals and that we don't know what's going on, but there's a level of transparency and openness and engagement with the broader community, particularly with the activist community, about issues, but whether it's the climate crisis or any other things. So anyway, those are just a few thoughts from me, Karl. How have you been thinking about what the possibilities are in this minority parliament?
So I actually, the morning after the election, I wrote more or less the same thing, that we've got to see a new, more transparent, open, kind of open-ended and consultative and collaborative Trudeau, not the Trudeau who hid out, who left the Prime Minister's office to go take selfies with people and then hid out there with Gerald Butts and made all the decisions. Even to the point in the last parliament, if we go back, we had Trudeau's 2, Katie Telford and Gerald Butts, who was 2 senior advisors, sitting in on caucus meetings, to the point where people who knew the caucus members said they were intimidated, they were afraid to say too much. I mean, people don't really quite know the extent to which this chap Gerald Butts was an actual eminence grise and a toxic element. People who were even part of the 38-member Liberal caucus in the prior parliament say he was impossible. He would cut people off. He would cut their access off a 38-member caucus, and he'd cut off access of people who contradicted him or disagreed with him. And many people, for instance, attribute the entire failure of the electoral reform exercise to Gerald Butts. I said, well, the problem was that Trudeau was uncertain about it. He's uncertain about a lot. He's really too much of a front man and uncertain and lacking confidence. And Gerald Butts thought the whole thing was a dumb idea, wasn't really interested. So it died. So I recommended, I said, Trudeau's first task is to lose Gerald Butts' phone number. We know he was in on
Yeah,
the, we know he
I
was
saw
in on the campaign.
I
But
saw that in your article. I thought it was a pretty cute way to end, to lose the phone number. And certainly, the inside situation, at the best of times, it's always very intense, right? And there's an enormous amount of pressure on all MPs to, be part of the caucus team, follow the party line, and do all of that. And so I think the irony that we have here is, on the one hand, in a minority parliament, there's potentially more political space to have new initiatives or stronger initiatives come forward. But on the other hand, because it is a minority parliament, the pressure is really on each party and on individual members not to screw it up, right? So what you're saying kind of doubles down in a minority parliament. So I'm very curious about how we can get past that. And I'm really hoping that the NDP, the party that I came from, will see this as an opportunity to kind of move beyond the precinct, and to engage in a broader way. And I mean, I know it's not necessarily easy to do that, but I do think it would be kind of an interesting and constructive feature of how a minority parliament operates. So anyway, I think it is going to be a very dynamic situation that takes place, and we'll have to see what happens.
one thing in a minority parliament is that on parliamentary committees, parliamentary committees are an aspect of parliament the public doesn't watch that closely, because we think of parliament being the House of Commons and question period, but in fact, as you know,
Yeah,
a lot of the work happens in the committees, and that's really
yeah.
key. And it's where often, even however partisan people are, I noticed when we were on Parliament Hill together, conservative and liberal members would come up to you, and you were kind of comrades in arms, being a member of the health committee or whatever committee you were on, and folk tackling with the problems you were tackling with. But too often in majority governments, the committees become just rubber stamps and just a place to get whatever the government wants and bypass the opposition members. The opposition members will have the majority on the parliamentary committees now, and there is an opportunity to really use them to engage the public and to shape legislation and to discuss issues in a serious way. And we hope that this is something, of course, Trudeau, all these things are things that Trudeau promised prior to the 2015 election. We were going to really empower the committees. We were going to have the chairs elected by all the members by secret ballot. We were not going to run the whole government out of the Prime Minister's office. All these we were going to have electoral reform. All the sort of thing that a lot of the people who still voted for him and supported him would say dismissively, "Oh, that's all process." I said, "That's not process. It's a process called democracy." I mean, there's a name for that process. It's our democratic system.
I remember Megan Leslie. She was on CBC on election night, and she actually talked about the committees during a minority parliament when she was there, and she spoke exactly about that, about how, because the opposition had a majority at the committee level, that there was a lot of space to kind of work more collaboratively, cooperatively, to do studies, to come up with recommendations to the government. So, and I think that is one avenue. But at a more formal level, a lot of people, when they think of minority parliament or minority government, they immediately think that there's, in their minds, the same words get used to it's a coalition. And of course, they're very different things, right? A coalition is where there's some sort of formal agreement. And I don't think we'll probably see that in this situation, because Trudeau has already made it clear that he's going to approach things on an issue by issue basis. And certainly that's what has happened in more recent history with minority governments. But I'm just wondering, do you foresee, what do you think, Karl, that whether there's some possibility that on certain key issues where there's overlap, even involving the other parties, the Green Party on climate change or the Bloc, that there might be some discussion and agreement to move forward in some critical ways? Are you thinking that that's a possibility?
Well, I really think that since this is a government that got into power with the lowest popular vote in the history, in proportionate terms, in the history of Canada, and got into power after losing 6% of its popular vote one election to the other, and actually has a lower popular vote than the official opposition, although there's other reasons for that. They want the legitimacy, and Trudeau started to indicate he saw them saying that we are not just implementing the liberal agenda, we're implementing what he calls the progressive agenda. And to do that, he has to do that really collaboratively. I would say at least with the NDP and the Greens. I mean, we can say the Bloc is progressive, is progressive on its right side, on its left side, and nationalist on its left side. It's a little bit all over the place. And the electorate of the Bloc may be more motivated by other issues than climate change and progressive issues. But if you just take the votes for Greens, NDP, and Liberals combined, that's 55% of the votes. So you can say we're representing not the 33% of the people who elected us, the Liberals, we're representing 55% of the electorate if they really do engage in cooperative and collaborative policy making with the NDP and the Greens. I don't know if they have it in them. I think they should do that. It really will take a kind of total psychological change from the people who consider themselves to be the natural governing party.
And I think that's why the engagement and pressure from outside of Parliament is going to be particularly important. I hope that, whether it's the Labour movement or NGOs or key organizations, don't sort of sit back. I mean, one of the things that was really fascinating about the election was the unveiling of the Green New Deal across the country by all kinds of organizations. And I think it really helped set the stage for making the climate crisis one of the critical issues, if not the critical issue, in this federal election. So I think if there's a pressure coming from the outside on this idea of broader engagement, of transparency, and not sort of having, whether it's Gerald Butts and somebody else doing some little deal behind closed door. I mean, I think we actually need to keep that pressure up, and make it clear that this is what Canadians are expecting. We want to see a different kind of politics. And as you point out, this is something that Trudeau has always talked about, but he's not good at delivering. I always like to think that the Liberals are very good at window dressing, but when you actually go into the store, it's pretty empty, Just changing topics slightly, though, I'm sure you saw today the story with Elizabeth May, where she's really kind of loading it up and saying, well, the NDP should not agree to anything unless they can get Trudeau to agree to not proceed with the pipeline. I thought, wow, well, that's really upping the ante. So did you catch that story too?
I did, only I was a little bit busy today and I didn't have a look in detail. And I think this is very awkward for the NDP because the NDP has at least one member from Edmonton, Strathcona, who's not on side with that view, whose view is let the courts make the decision. She's sort of saying, phew, I'm glad there doesn't have to be a parliamentary vote on this, and we'll let the courts make that decision. So, and I think, Jagmeet Singh and Rachel Notley are openly in disagreement on this issue, but I think
have been for a while.
They're trying to make peace with each other. They're trying to make nice with each other, and Rachel Notley is not reluctant to push back. And she, at the same time as Elizabeth May, is saying Jagmeet doesn't understand the need for this pipeline and how this is part of the grand bargain that we have to achieve with the energy producing problems in order to transition out of fossil fuels. So we're not that is his position, but it is still the position of more people than we like to think in the NDP, or potentially more people who voted for the NDP. And we have to note that unfortunately Sven Robinson lost his attempt to win a seat right on the path of the pipeline to a Liberal member, and that the disgraced Conservative had a lot of votes. She wasn't even the Conservative candidate.
I know, she wasn't even on the ballot at the end. I know, and she still got a lot of votes.
So yeah, it is something that they have to. I think the NDP, being still more a party of power, not entirely of principle, is going to have a hard time. I don't think it would be the NDP's inclination to try to leverage decisions that way. I think their inclination would be let's deal with what actually comes before Parliament. The
Yeah,
pipeline is not any legislation before Parliament, so there's no need to actually, we're not going to say reintroduce new legislation, sell the pipeline that you bought, and introduce new legislation changing the previous legislation of a previous Parliament. I don't think that would be the inclination of the NDP. You may know more than I, but I don't.
No, I think you're spot on. What I find interesting though is that Elizabeth May herself is leveraging this, right, and sort of trying to squeeze the NDP into what she thinks is some kind of position, like, oh well, you guys have got more votes. The Green Party's got 3 votes. You guys have got 24 votes. So you now she's giving advice to the NDP about what she thinks they could do. And I thought, oh well, this is just too cute by far, because of course she's in no position to do anything. And I do agree that the way we've seen it before is that it's really been more about where there is some commonality, then you have the opportunity to move forward. Like in 2005, for example, when the NDP made a critical amendment to the Liberal budget and was able to roll back, I think it was $4.6 billion in a corporate tax reduction and move that into an investment in things like housing and transit and pensions. That was it was a window that appeared, and Jack Layton jumped right in and said to the Liberals, okay, you want our support, this is what we want to see happen. And in fact, I was one of the people that negotiated that deal with the Liberals. So we don't know for sure how it's going to play out, but I have a sense that there's not necessarily going to be an overall package, that it may well be on an issue by issue basis. Maybe the NDP will try to push that further though, and say, there are a number of things here that we want to see movement on. But again, I think that pressure from externally, both to the Liberals and the NDP, is going to be very important. Oh, go ahead.
No, but I think also we have to remember that we're just talking about caucuses, that the NDP, even with a reduced caucus, has a member, actually, in moving from Linda Duncan to as I first, we probably have a member now who's going to be more independent of the larger party. At least on this, she's already projected, saying, well, I'm kind of more on Rachel Notley's team on the Kinder Morgan twinning project than I am on Jagmeet Singh's team, but I don't think we're going to have to worry about it because it's not going to come before Parliament. Still, the Liberals themselves went trying to be, some would say, a little bit cute and a little bit too acrobatic, and recruited Stephen Guilbeault to be candidate in Montreal in the riding that had once been Gilles Duceppe and then was represented by Thérèse Laverdière, and now he wanted for the Liberals. He was the head of an environmental organization called Equité. He says, well, I'm running for the Liberals, but I'm against the Kinder Morgan project. So somehow Trudeau thought, I can get away with that. And now people are saying, is he going to make him environment minister? Well, I think this poor guy is going to become environment minister. He'd either have to betray his principles or suddenly the government's going to have to change. So, I mean, we have complicated relationships within the parties and between the parties. But I do think that the NDP would be advised to try to look at a kind of series of measures that they could try to get the Liberals to actually do, and then make it obvious, at least get clear public credit for it. I think in terms of the environment, it's more, rather than looking at a particular pipeline project, which may or may not happen, it's all tied up in the courts now in any case, but rather to look at the question of fossil fuel subsidies and to what extent, because this is where the NDP has been very strong and the Liberals have been weak, and to say, let's look at the range of subsidies. Where can we at least establish targets for tapering them up? I mean, what the Liberals will say is, well, there's economic consequences. There's people's jobs at stake. There's work that has to happen. And people are used to having these various tax breaks, which are effective subsidies that are part of our history. Other countries offer them. But I think this is an area where they should push hard on the environmental side. Unfortunately, for the progressive parties, the NDP, even the Greens, the one policy area where Trudeau chose to pronounce himself at his post-election press conference is nowhere anywhere on the priority list of any progressive in Canada. That's a tax cut. A tax cut calls it a middle-class tax cut. It will cut the taxes of lower and middle income by people of a few $100s, but It's universal. It'll apply to most higher incomes as well. And it's not anywhere. I mean, and Andrew Jackson, the economist with the broadband center, said it's a $6 billion cost to that for very little benefit compared to investing in something like free university tuition. So they're going to have to push back against that. Now, I mean, is he
Well,
daring
that's
to vote
likely.
against that?
That's likely to come up through a budget, right? And I mean, the first two tests of confidence of the government that are automatically confidence votes. One is the speech from the throne that people should expect to see when it's usually the first day after the election of the speaker. There's a speech from the throne that lays out the government's broad agenda. And the votes, there's a series of votes on the speech from the throne, and those are all confidence votes. Then sometime after that, there will be a budget, some probably in February. That, of course, is a confidence vote. And I think, you know, your point about tax cuts, we shouldn't discount, of course, that Trudeau is possibly going to rely and look to the Conservatives on some elements, because I think during the election, one of your articles, I remember, made a very good historical point about how much the Conservatives and the Liberals share in common in terms of their economic policies and taxation policies and trade policies. So, you know, here we are, we're sort of thinking about the crossover and the commonality that might be between the Liberals and NDP and the Greens. And for sure, there are very key issues, but there's also a lot of commonality on economic questions between the Liberals and the Conservatives. So how this cuts, you know, on some of these key votes will be very interesting, because at the end of the day, unless they won an election, which I don't think any party does anytime soon, those initial votes, somebody has to back the government. They have to get a majority of votes, otherwise the government will automatically fall. So I think the taxation question is also going to be very much a part of the mix of what goes on here.
I think, but just one small point, I do think they might have time. They sometimes do the fall economic update, which famously in 2008, Harper came in with the throne speeches, and right away he came in with the hammer with the fall economic update, where he abolished the per capita grant to all parties based on votes, and where he came with a statement during the height of the recession saying we're going to achieve a balanced budget. Somehow it was fantasy. So
and it was right after that the coalition proposition came forward. Do you remember?
So the other parties wanted to vote against it. But
yeah,
we don't have that option. We don't know, the Conservatives and the NDP and Greens aren't going to form a coalition, that's for sure.
No, but that's what happened in 2008. I mean, it was pretty radical, and it almost could have happened, but the Liberals bailed on it. But yeah, there could be a full economic update for sure.
And that's where I think Trudeau was telegraphing that at his news conference when he said, our first measure right away, he said, is going to be a tax cut. And I think he was telegraphing that they'll bring it in before the 2020 budget, that they'll put it into some kind of measure before the House rises at the end of this year. I may be wrong. It was a disappointment to those who were hoping that he'd have a more progressive face, because that is not a particularly progressive piece of legislation.
Yeah. Karl, I'm just going to switch tacks here, because we've got some comments and questions coming in from people. And one of them is actually directed to you. And that is, how do you plan to change your coverage, or how will it change for you in terms of covering Parliament Hill? Does it make a difference for a journalist in terms of what you look for and what you do? I mean, I think that's a really great question.
But knowing that anything can bring the government down, knowing that in the parliaments that we've had from 2011 until now, we had two majority governments, you were essentially analyzing measures that were going to happen. If the government introduced legislation, they were almost certainly going to happen because the government had a majority. So you were talking about the merits of those measures. Say when the Harper government introduced the so-called anti-terrorism legislation, you knew they were hell-bent for leather to get it through, but then you wanted to arouse people's interest and to remind them of what the true consequences were, regardless of whether it was going to get through Parliament or not. Now, the part of one's attention has to be focused on whether or not this will actually get the support of Parliament, or whether they're going to have to change it and amend it, in order to make sure they get support of Parliament. So when a bill now goes to committee, it'll be important, it'll be consequential. The bill goes to committee, and if we're talking about potential amendments, the support for that bill may depend on those amendments. Now, the other side of it is, I know perfectly well that the opposition parties do not want another election. Actually, the party that least wants another election, believe it or not, is the Bloc Québécois. For them, they got a nice deal. They get members of Parliament salaries right through to the next election. They get to hang out there. They know they can be gone, and they sort of have no particular purpose in being there, in the sense that they don't aspire to be part of the government ever. So they're sort of there just to take their salaries and make a little noise and act important. What do they? I mean, and the Bloc leader said it himself. He said he can stay in power for 4 years. It's up to him to manage it. He'd be just as happy for 4 years, because that's 4 years of a member of Parliament's salary. Great deal. So
And he had
4 years towards a pension.
He had a nice little smile on his face when he said that, I remember.
Yeah.
I think the elephant in the room, we've talked about some of the issues in the minority parliament, but the other sort of the elephant in the room is proportional representation. This important democratic reform that has eluded the people of Canada. We've had referendums in BC that have failed. There's been referendums elsewhere in Canada. We've had commitments. We've had promises after promises of, well, certainly from the Liberal government. We know that the makeup of this parliament would be entirely different if it had been based on proportional representation. I think, for example, the NDP would have had about 157 seats and the Liberals would have had about 112. I know a lot of people are thinking, okay, is there any chance that we can make any movement on PR? And I don't know about you, Karl, but my own response is that it's always got to be part of the debate. I don't know whether anything will significantly change on it, but I think in terms of whatever is unfolding in Ottawa, in whatever discussions, and certainly in the broader public, we have to keep this pressure up about proportional representation and say to particularly the two parties, the Liberals and the NDP, that we have to follow through on this. Any feelings on that you have?
I think the big argument, I think there's a stronger argument for us to have another electoral system that would be not entirely proportional, but partly proportional, or perhaps organized in a different way. But I think some element of proportionality would be necessary. It's more relevant for the federal parliament than it would be for any provincial parliament. Why? Because we're a very regionalized country. And what our system, you have incentives in a given system. Our system rewards you as a political party if you decide to focus your efforts regionally, not broadly across the country. So parties of principle, like both the NDP and the Green Party, that represent ideas of how the country should be run and represent the interests of, to some extent, social classes and the interests of broad-based groups of people who live everywhere in the country, are disadvantaged compared to a party like the Bloc Québécois that says, we're running candidates in 78 ridings in one province, and we only care about sticking up for the narrow interests of the particular region that we happen to represent. The extreme case of that happened in 1993, where you had the Reform Party that did not run candidates in Quebec at all, that only ran candidates in English Canada. That was the largest party outside of Liberals in English Canada. And you had the Bloc that dominated Quebec, and you punished the two parties that had sort of had some sense of being national, the old Progressive Conservative Party and the NDP, were punished by the system. The NDP was banished to not even having a parliamentary status. So it's not as extreme this time, but the fact that the Bloc has 32 seats for about 7% of the vote nationally, compared to the combined NDP and Green seats of 27, for a total combined proportion of the popular vote of more than 20%, of 22 or 23%. In other words, 3 times the popular vote yields 27 seats compared to the 32 seats. And I think that is something that every political party should be concerned with, that we're creating a system that actually destabilizes our federation, because it gives It doesn't reward people who are seeking to broadly appeal to people on the basis of ideas, the basis of
it is really an incredible optic in the system that we have and what it produces. And I sort of have a sense that on the one hand, for a lot of people, proportional representation or some sort of democratic reform, a lot of people still see it as something very complicated and they don't quite understand it. And yet it would absolutely transform not only the makeup of parliament so that people's vote is actually counting and it would give a better regional balance. It would also ensure that more women were elected and people from racialized communities. So it seems to me that if we want to keep this question front and center of democratic reform, we're going to really have to up the ante on that in terms of keeping the pressure on. Otherwise, we're just going to continue and we'll go through another election cycle, and these extremes of how it plays out across the country. You've pointed out historically what that looked like, and it's really quite incredible when you look back, as you say, to that 93 election. So I think we've got a lot of work still to bring this issue forward and to ensure that it informs the debate on a lot of the issues that we're talking about. Going to switch back, Karl, just to another question that came in that I think is a nice little nugget of a very good example of something that could be picked up. And the question is, shouldn't the NDP and Greens call for conversion of the Oshawa GM plant to electric vehicles as a challenge to the idea of tax cuts and spending public money on the pipeline? Very, very nicely put there. So the idea, I mean, you were talking earlier about it may be very difficult to tackle the pipeline question, particularly because it's in the courts. But the other side of that coin is to really look for common ground and agreement on the greening of our economy, right? Of that transformation of the economy that doesn't throw working people under the bus, so to speak. So the Oshawa plant, the GM plant, I think is a terrific example. I would love to see some movement on that and some agreement. I mean, to me, that's something very concrete. It's about jobs, but it's also, it would be a demonstration of leadership that Parliament, the government, parliamentarians can begin that transformation in an equitable and a decent way.
I know somebody proposed, I can't remember, somebody had proposed, and I actually reported it on at the time, that essentially they create a federally owned company that would produce a brand of electric car using the Oshawa, buying the Oshawa plant from GM and using that Oshawa plant. As an aside, it's a tragedy that at the point at which the Canadian government kept General Motors, if it weren't for the intervention of the United States and American governments, wouldn't exist anymore. I mean, tragically for the workers, the company would have folded because nobody would. They were a bankrupt company, and no business that's in the business of banking was going to lend them money and allow them to keep going. So they essentially were taken over by these two governments. But their attitude was, the minute they're on their feet, we'll just give them the best deal possible and get out of it and get out of the business of cars. What they should have done is stayed in that business and kept a leveraged position so that they actually continued to be part owners in the name of the Canadian people of the company, so they had some influence on the decisions. They did. The Harper government actually decided to sell the several $1 billion of shares in order to balance the budget. That was all. They sort of sold them at a bargain rate rather than hanging on to them and keeping that leverage with the company that we saved, that we helped, that we Canadians, we taxpayers helped save from complete extinction. So all those executive jets, they wouldn't have had them. And we should have absolutely insisted that they completely, I mean, going way back when the American government during the Depression, the old Roosevelt government, got into partnership with business, they established limits on executive salaries, and they established social benefit requirements. They had all kinds of problems, such as they continued to have racist measures included. That was the times. That was horrible. But we of course, this was a conservative government that was forced into doing this, because otherwise it would have been losing all those jobs in Ontario. But that's too bad now. You know, now there's a great reluctance to envision, to think government can do something. I mean, government, you know, Air Canada was a government created entity. The CBC was created and is still owned by the government. The CN Railroad became a government entity. Via Rail is still a government entity, but not properly funded or well managed. But there's no truth to the notion. There's no demonstrable truth to the notion that private industry necessarily operates any economic activity better than the public, something owned by the public and operated in the public interest.
I think,
we have to
I
prove
think,
it.
I think you're speaking to what many progressives feel, and that is sort of a lack of national vision about what's possible and thinking outside the box. I do think, however, that, I mean, we've talked about federal entities of the political parties. I do think that there is a very strong move at the local level. For example, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the mayors across the big city mayors, as they're called. I was speaking to Mayor Kennedy Stewart from Vancouver on election night, and he was already, raring to go. Because he had spoken to all of the party leaders, excepting for Andrew Scheer, who declined his invitation during the election. And there was no question that from a local government point of view, they are very eager to think outside the box, to be creative, to bring forward initiatives. For example, the two big ones would be housing, affordable housing, and transit, public transit, where we need to see major public investment. So I'm optimistic. I'm always an optimist, but I'm hopeful that these kinds of pressures will begin to force the hand, and that we can see some really interesting propositions come forward that would be very good, certainly in the urban environment, but even in smaller communities as well.
Well, housing was a very major plank for the
Yes.
P, and the Liberals have made some moves to make housing more affordable and accessible.
But they never put the money out, did they? I mean, they've been holding back on the money. Unbelievable.
They expressed at least the in principle agreement idea. At least they are rhetorically on side. I guess this is a big difference. So one thinks that you can at least deal with the Liberals, or the Conservatives have an entirely different ideology and philosophy, and don't think that it's really the responsibility of the government to worry about that. When you think at the basic level that we're a country, if we said to people, Canadians, tomorrow, I mean, and this is why even the most right-wing politician won't say that, tomorrow, whether or not you get healthcare will depend whether or not you can pay for it. As of tomorrow, well, healthcare is a commodity. And the argument would be, well, whether or not you get housing depends on whether or not you can pay for it. Whether or not you get food depends on whether or not you can pay. Why should healthcare be a different kind of commodity? Healthcare, after all, is just another commodity in our market economy. Why are we excluding it? And so you can turn that on its head and say, if we consider that it is a right to have healthcare. So in other words, we're going to treat a homeless person when they get sick, and they would give them a home as long as they're in the hospital. And then they're going to be homeless and get sick again when they leave the hospital.
Yeah.
What's the point of that? So we have to absolutely start treating some of these basic. We somehow got into this position where we are socialists when it comes to healthcare, but we're capitalists when it comes to the rest of society. But your health is part of where you live, the air you breathe, the food you eat, the exercise you get, the capacity you have for a good life. We can't expect the healthcare system to make your life good if it treats you only on an acute care basis when you get so sick that you go to the hospital. Well, the rest of the time, you care if you sleep on the street.
Well, I mean, Canada, I mean, really, when you look at it, our social safety net has been shrinking. I always think that we're under the illusion, we have this idea as Canadians, and sometimes the Americans, progressive Americans, they say, oh, things are so great in Canada, you have healthcare. And so we have this notion in our heads that we have the social safety net, but in actual fact, so much of that has been torn away, beginning with, going back to 1995 when the social and health transfers were cut by Paul Martin. And so the role of the federal government has so dramatically changed. We used to have a federal housing program that was very successful. They've promised pharmacare now, I think it's for 22 years. I don't know how many budget cycles we've gone through. So, those are fundamental questions, but But I think there's increasing organization and pressure from groups like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to now hold the government to account in terms of the housing dollars or transit dollars. And maybe we'll see movement on a pharmacare program. You know, I mean, that would be something, you know, to finally see that happen.
Well, I think we can just hope that the Prime Minister gets the right kind of advisors this time and decides to operate in a democratic way, and that we could use the parliamentary process if we really did open it up. Where, I mean, parliamentary committees is where witnesses, you're supposed to have witnesses, where social groups and people with interest, interest in issues get together and express their view. If it's used properly, that becomes an avenue for pushing forward an agenda of change and an agenda of increasing and strengthening the social safety net. So I just had a sign saying my internet connection is unstable. What does that mean?
Yeah. Well, I can still see you, and I can definitely hear you, so that's good.
Right, that's good.
We're getting towards our wrap up time, Karl, and I did want to canvass sort of one question, which I think you're really good on, because you've reported in Quebec, you know the scene so well, and that is, what do you think? What kind of factor is the Bloc going to be? What I remember as the Bloc when I first got elected is that they were really progressive, and on a lot of issues, the NDP and the Bloc, like fighting back to work legislation, on social questions, on foreign affairs, for example. There was more commonality between the Bloc and the NDP than any other party. I think the Bloc has changed a lot. It's become a lot more conservative. They're so focused now on these very divisive questions of identity and religious symbols. So I'm not feeling so positive about the role that the Bloc is going to play. Just wondering if you have any thoughts on that too.
I tend to agree with you that I think the program of the Bloc and the leader of the Bloc, Yves-François Blanchet, he was a Quebec environment minister. He said in Quebec that the environment was to be his key concern, but and certainly on some on some foreign policy issues, they're going to be pro-peace and against, as Quebec historically has been, against military entanglements. But the Bloc as a group, I mean, if you go back to the Bloc that you know before the Orange Wave, there were a lot of urban members of the Bloc. They had a lot of members in Montreal and area. They didn't get very many. So their membership, their voters, actually, unusual for a nationalist, a separatist party or quasi-separatist party, skew older and more rural and more small town. And they're mostly motivated by the fact that the Bloc is going to be an ally of the small c conservative nationalist party, the Coalition Avenir Québec, that's in power in Quebec City now. So that is going to be a bit, the only reassuring aspect is those issues that relate to their preoccupation aren't necessarily going to come up in Parliament. I mean, I don't think, where are we going to have an opportunity to discuss Quebec Law 21 in Parliament? It really is not part of the parliamentary agenda. It's not going to, and unless the Bloc wants to introduce an opposition motion saying,
which they could do, they could easily do.
We will not interfere. Somebody suggested to me, an interviewer in Halifax, says, what if the Bloc tries to corner Trudeau and say, we'll get a parliamentary motion saying we're going to offer a deferred prosecution agreement to SNC-Lavalin? What will happen then? I said, the Trudeau government will simply say, this is a decision, this is outside of politics. The Attorney General will make the choice, and we'll pressure the Attorney General behind closed doors where nobody can see, and we'll turn off the microphones when it happens next time, and we won't, and make sure this is on
well,
but we're not going to have Parliament vote on this. It's not up to Parliament to decide how a criminal prosecution operates. So, but they could be mischievous, but the fact of the matter is the Bloc really doesn't want an election, fortunately. So
yeah, well, I think it's going to really lead to some very interesting debate in the next year, 2 years, however long this Minority Parliament loss. I hope that today we've been able to open up some discussion, and we're just about running out of time now, Karl. So I want to thank you, Karl, for joining in this conversation. It's always so great to talk to you because you, first of all, you have this fantastic memory of what's happened historically, and your ability to kind of bring it forward to the present and make it relevant is really very cool. And I do want to thank everyone for joining us on this webinar today. Rabble does want to continue having these types of conversations with contributors and readers. So for those folks who are listening in, thank you for your comments and your questions. And if you haven't yet, please feel free to tell your friends about Rabble and how they can contribute online at patreon.com/rabble. And if you'd like to see more of this kind of discussion take place, please let us know. If you have topics or guests or ideas of things that you'd like to come forward. And just like to say thank you, Karl, and thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you. Next time I'll play the piano.
Cool.
Thank you very much, all of you.